Okay, so I think we'll get started. My name is Michelle Meckelberg. I am a board member of ASCMA and very pleased to welcome Dr. Jackie Ellis to join us today for our afternoon learning. So I'll give just a brief overview of Dr. Ellis's career and then let her jump into it. So Dr. Ellis is a board certified by both the Animal Behavior Society as a certified applied animal behaviorist and is certified in shelter behavior, with a focus on feline stress and elimination behavior. Today, she's going to speak to us on the Ordinal rating scale system that she developed to monitor behavioral indicators of well-being in cats. So again, want to warmly welcome Dr. Ellis and have you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here today. So I'm going to start with, so everybody bear with me while I figure out technology. I'm going to share my screen. Then I'm going to make the presentation appear. There we are. Okay, so hello everyone. As mentioned, I am Dr. Jacqueline Ellis. I'm the Director of Behavior at Toronto Humane Society. And today I'll be talking about my paper, Beyond Doing Better, Ordinal Rating Scales to Monitor Behavioral Indicators of Well-Being in Cats, which was recently published in the journal Animals. So the paper essentially is about 4 scales that I developed to help monitor the well-being, primarily fear, of our cats using behavioral evidence. We've been using these scales for a few years now, and I found them so helpful in managing the cases of our more fearful cats. I've shared them with a few other organizations who have been very excited about them as well. And this conference seems a great opportunity to get the word out a little bit more. They're relatively simple, which means that they can be used by a broad range of people. And after some introductory training, they have just excellent interobserver reliability. I truly believe that they can be a really big help to other organizations that are struggling with the same problems that I was. So, despite our best efforts, shelters are a scary place. Due to their relative lack of exposure to novelty, the shelter environment can be particularly stressful for cats. So it's the responsibility of shelter staff and volunteers to do everything within our power to ensure that cats have the best possible life while they're in our care. And this is primarily through using environmental enrichment, behavior modification, and medication. But it is imperative that we not only use these strategies, but actually evaluate their impact and make adjustments to their plan if improvements are not being made to their well-being. At THS, we've been doing this for years through monitoring the comments that were left by volunteers after their human-animal interaction as enrichment sessions. However, the language in these comments was just vague, right? It wasn't giving me exactly what I needed to make these assessments. They weren't consistent in their language or what behaviors they were reporting. And sometimes their comments were not even about the animal's behavior at all. So here I just have a couple of examples. So first we have, oh, the cat was getting better. You think, well, okay, getting better at what? What behavior was improving? What did better look like? Was better good or just better for that cat? The next is, it was a good day for her. Okay, well, was it a good day for any cat or was it just a good day for her? Was a good day still bad? So the next volunteer can't look at that note and say the next day was an even better day or a worse day because they don't really know what that means. Or comments like, I gave him treats and wiggled the wand toy, or he let me pet him. Okay, so you gave him treats, but did he eat them? Or you wiggled the wand toy, did it pique his interest? Did he play with it? How much did he play with it? And he let me pet him. Did he let you pet him or did he enjoy the petting? So sometimes cats can be so frozen from fear, they'll let you do pretty much anything, but that doesn't really tell me much about the emotional state of that cat. Saying he enjoyed petting would give me a lot more information. So as a result, I found the information was super insufficient to really interpret the cat's well-being and whether or not they were improving or if we were meeting their needs. But it's really hard to blame them. As I mentioned, I hadn't really instructed them properly. So I needed a solution. I asked myself, what do I really want to know? And how do I want them to report it? There are many pieces of information that could be used to evaluate the well-being of cats, but I decided to pare it down to just a few specific key behaviors. And I really wanted to standardize the languages they use to report these behaviors. I also wanted to standardize the conditions under which they were collecting the information as much as possible. I mean, we all know within a shelter, there's no such thing as standardized. Standard is chaos, but trying to make it as routine and controlled as an environment as we could. I also wanted to find a way that I could understand all of this information quickly at a glance, because this would save a lot of time in really interpreting how the cat's doing on these behaviors, and if they're getting better, if they're getting worse, saving me the time from just sifting through full paragraphs of text, but still getting a really good picture of the cat's well-being or progress at a glance. So to me, the answer was clear. I really wanted to represent these behaviors numerically, but what was the best method for measuring these behaviors? There are so many different ways to measure behavior. Within research, one of the most common ways is continuous behavior observation. Often this entails setting up a video camera, watching the video camera afterwards and coding their behaviors, sometimes going as far as pressing a button every time they change their posture, behavior, location. Believe me, I've coded thousands of hours of tape. This is not really practical in a shelter situation. It's just too resource intensive for what we're doing, for the numbers of animals that we're working with and the amount of person hours that we have. So another way I could look at it is presence absence data. So did the cat lunge? Yes or no? Did the cat enjoy petting? More defined than that, hopefully, but something along those lines. Yes or no? And this is good. It's pretty simple, and it allows us to get an answer that is fairly objective. But it requires, and the other thing is that it requires a little training, which is good. But it does lack the sensitivity to capture subtle changes over time. So we can't say, you could say yes or no, did the cat play? But you can't measure how enthusiastically was the cat playing. Was it just kind of timidly patting at the toy, or was it bouncing all over the room looking at it, following it? Although I will report on one way that we use presence absence data at Toronto Humane Society as a little bonus at the end of the presentation about my paper. So for my purposes, for this paper and for generally how we look at welfare and progress and certain behaviors, the expression of certain behaviors for cats at Toronto Humane Society, is we use an ordinal rating scale. It seemed the best choice as it can represent various levels of intensity, can be measured live, meaning we don't have to watch tapes afterwards, and can efficiently summarize a lot of data. And it can very easily reveal patterns of improvement or deterioration, looking at graphs of these ordinal scales, 0 to 5. How enthusiastically do they play with defined levels for each step? Of course, we do need to make sure that this data is reliable. Meaning, if I give the cat a 4 on a scale, that would be the same as if someone else if you gave the cat a 4 on the scale, or if he gave a cat a 4 on the scale, and so forth. We want to make sure that it's reliable between individuals and also that it's accurate. So it's actually depicting what we think it's depicting. So within the field of assessing well-being in cats, ordinal data are already being used. So the cat stress score, often just shortened to the CSS, is ubiquitous in the literature. You'll see it all over, and it sets a good precedent for using this type of data across time and individual raters to communicate objective information about a cat's behavior and emotional state. So this table is kind of gives you an idea of what the cat stress score is. Cats are assigned a score from 1, from fully relaxed, down to 7, which is terrified, taking into account 11 different postural behavioral categories, such as their body position, eyes, ears, their activity, and so on. So you will see this all over the place, but it has been criticized for not being sensitive enough to recognize certain expressions of stress. For example, it does not really capture feigned sleep very well, which is a huge behavior that we see that's a big indicator of stress in shelters. And it is lacking a published training guide, which means that it's hard for people to really get on board with understanding each of the nuances. And within the literature, the interobserver reliability is rarely reported, and when it is, it's variable. So some studies show really good interobserver reliability, and some show such abysmal interobserver reliability, you're surprised the paper got published. So just for your information, each of these empty cells in the paper that describes the cat stress score, there are definitions in here. Just for the interest in making it fit on a slide that was legible, I left them blank, but they would be described what a weakly relaxed tail position would look like, and so on. Okay, so with all this in mind, I decided to create 4 different ordinal rating scales. So the first one I selected was the fear, anxiety, and stress score. So technically, I did not actually create this one. I simply adapted it from the Fear-Free program. I decided to use this instead of the CAT stress score for a couple of reasons. One, because the CAT stress score isn't really great at capturing that feigned sleep. But probably more importantly, because Fear-Free Pets, the fear, anxiety, and stress score is also, there's also a dog version. So we're able to use similar scales in dogs and in cats, giving people just a better idea of what the scores mean overall. If we were using a 1 to 7 scale in cats and a 0 to 5 scale in dogs, people would have a hard time kind of flipping back and forth between them, I felt. So we did adapt this score for our purposes. The next is the response to petting score. So I started to notice that while enjoyment of petting often tracked with FAS, so when your fear reduced, often you started enjoying petting more, that wasn't always the case. Some cats were really reducing in really notable stress-related behaviors, but still not wanting to be touched, while other cats were still being very, very fearful, but did enjoy petting. So this gave us the ability to kind of tease those 2 aspects apart and have a more thorough understanding of their experience at the shelter. Similarly, participation in play is another aspect of their experience at the shelter that we could measure. We found that sometimes some cats enjoyed play much more than petting. So if we are only looking at these 2 variables, the fear, anxiety, and stress, and the response to petting, we were missing that aspect of their experience. And if we're able to, let's say a cat still enjoys petting the same way and their fear, anxiety, and stress score is still relatively the same, but they've started to really come out of their shell with play, that's something that we want to know because it does imply something about their well-being. Not playing doesn't necessarily mean you have poor welfare, but play is generally a behavior that animals only exhibit when they have good welfare. So it is good to know that. And it lets us know it opens up a whole other area of things we can use as reinforcers. Generally, when we're doing positive reinforcement with our pets, we think of food as the reinforcer that we use. But for cats that respond very well to with a really increased participation in play, and they're super, super strong players, that tells us that perhaps we should be using play with this particular animal for their reinforcer in positive reinforcement training. And finally, I have a food intake summary score. Anyone who works at a shelter or works with stressed animals at all is well aware of the relationship between food intake and stress in cats. And most shelters, I would wager to say all shelters, are already measuring food intake in their cats to make sure that they're eating every day as a measure, a red flag of something being wrong medically. But sometimes we measure this in such detail that I personally, at least, I look at our food intake sheets and I say, okay, are they eating, yes or no? So because we measure their wet food intake, their dry food intake, both meals a day. And so this gives us a summary of their wet and dry intake in the last 2 meals on a 0 to 5 scale. And so we're able to kind of get like just at a snapshot, better picture of if they are eating well. So all 4 of these scales were developed on a scale from 0 to 5, where 0 is the best possible score and 5 is the worst possible score. I trialed this out with the feline training assistants for a few months and made some adjustments based on the feedback I got, and then rolled out the program with a group of select volunteers. So my hypothesis was that after training, observers would have excellent interobserver agreement and reliability for each scale. So meaning my 4 would be the same as your 4 would be the same as his 4. So again, just a quick recap of what the methods of this paper are. First, I created and refined these scales. Then I standardized the interactions. Then I trained the raters. And then I tested the raters. So we've already talked about creating and refining the scales a little bit, but I'm going to go into those a little bit more detail now so that you can get a better picture of what the different scores on each of the different scales look like. So first we have the fear, anxiety, and stress score. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the graphic on this slide, as it is the one that comes with the Fear-Free Pets program. However, we've made a few changes to it, really minimal changes overall, The biggest change is that sometimes, like for example, perked interested, I think it was 0 to 1 could be this one. Whereas we just kind of separated them out so that they're each associated with an individual number. Excuse me. Just making it a little bit more adapted to our purposes, where we're looking for individual numbers to check for changes over time, as opposed to the original purpose, which was just to kind of get a record of the animal's general stress levels. We're looking for a more specific stress level. We also developed a more specific training program for how to identify which specific number you were looking at when you were looking at a cat, by defining what types of behaviors and what severity of those behaviors would be seen at each of these numbers. So that's the first scale. The next scale is the response to petting scale. So you can see here that 0 to 5, where 0 is the best, 5 is the worst. And 0, the definition of 0 is approach you and actively interact with you. Tail up, rubbing against you, headbutting, maybe cheerful vocalizations, maybe purring. A 2 is stay where they are, but show mild signs of enjoyment. Often this is you pet under their chin and they just kind of lift it just a little bit, but they still have a tense body. And a 5 is they flee from your attempts to touch, or they lunge at your attempts to touch. So next, we have the participation in play scale. Similarly, here in this table, you'll see 0 at the top, which is the best, and 5 at the bottom, which is the worst. 0 is enthusiastically playing, moving around the environment. 2 is enthusiastically plays from a stationary position. And 5 is no interest in playing or retreats from attempts at play. And finally, we have the food intake scale. So we have 0 at the top, again, the best, which is ate at least 3/4 of either wet or dry at both meals. 2 is ate at least 3/4 of either wet or dry at either meal. And 5 is none nibbling. So you may notice that 0 is not ate all. That's because we're really only collecting these types of scales on cats that we already have some concerns about. So from a stress, usually stress related, some sort of behavior perspective, most often fear or stress. So if they're eating more than what's at the 0, that's good. And we're really trying to get more granularity so that we can really see shifts at this end of the spectrum that is a bit more of a concerning side. So that was the development and refinement of these scales. So now we'll talk a little bit about how we standardize the interaction session. So you can collect these scales at any time you're looking at the cat, with a couple of exceptions. You can't collect the RTP if you're not attempting to pet the cat, and you can't collect the participation in play if you're not attempting to play with the cat, so on. But in general, the purposes of this were to collect more standardized information during our human interaction as enrichment sessions conducted primarily by the volunteers. So we wanted to make sure that we were standardizing the types of environments that the people would be collecting this information in. We do want to make sure that we're having interobserver reliability so that 1 4 is the same as another 4. But the main purpose of these scales is to get ideas of the cat's progress, right? So if one person is walking in and being really calm and giving them some time to get adjusted and then collecting a score, and the next person just walks in guns a-blazing, loud, bing, bang, boom, and collects a score, then we're not going to really get an impression of whether or not the cat improved or got worse. We're really just getting an impression of how they responded to these different approaches. So we want to make sure that everyone is actually, not just that we have good interobserver reliability between people, but that people are really well trained to improve the lives of these cats and help them with their behavior modification. So these are the instructions that people were given for these sessions. So first is to do their homework. So doing your homework involves a couple of steps. So first is to read the instructions that are given for each cat. So there are some overall instructions they have for every cat at THS, how to interact with, but each cat individually gets specific instructions. So here's an example. So for Mika and Norman are housed together, so they were companion cats. Mika is friendly, but takes time to enjoy petting and can get overstimulated. Please go slow with considerate approach. Do not reach into hiding spot with hands. Okay to offer food or catnip on the end of a back scratcher. Try play. Do not pet unless Mika asks for it, rubbing against you. Can swat if quick movements or touch is forced, for self or Norman. Exercise, 3-pet rule. Notify tech or vet if you observe Mika or Norman vomit. No treats. May try to escape room. Enter carefully. So you can see all sorts of really valuable information in there that will help you understand how to approach Mika in a way that Mika will be comfortable with, as well as giving you a heads up on a couple potential areas for, let's say, danger. So for example, you don't want her to escape. It's good to know that she's prone to that. And it's also interesting to note that if you try to pet Norman, Mika might come for you. So these are very important pieces of information to be aware of. So that's doing reading the instructions. Then you read the comments left by previous volunteers. So they might give even more information about, they're the most up. So we update these instructions once a week, let's say, but the most up-to-date information you can get is from the last volunteer who visited. And so if you look at the volunteer from yesterday's comments, then you might get some more information that's even more educational than is here on how to really tailor your interaction specifically to Mika. And the final instruction, of course, is to read the cat. So any cat can have a bad day or a good day. So perhaps the most friendly cat in the world, reading the instructions and reading the previous comments, you might get the impression that this cat's going to be a blast and really enjoy petting and playing and cuddling and everything like that. But you actually get to the cat's cage and it's a little bit more fearful. Perhaps the cat just had a vaccination or something, right? So despite any of the information you can do from the other parts in your homework, the reading the cat itself is really the ultimate step. And vice versa, perhaps there's a cat where all of the instructions and comments say that this cat is very fearful and potentially fractious. But maybe the cat was just given a dose of some sort of medication that makes it feeling a little bit more like it's on a 3-martini lunch and it's just having a great day. So then you can try perhaps other tactics that may not have been as successful on other days. So that's the first step, which is do your homework. The next step is to use a considerate approach. So always use a considerate approach, which is basically just make yourself seem as non-threatening as possible. Invite the cat to kind of initiate parts of it where possible. This is probably a term you're familiar with from the Fear Free Pets program. The next is to pair your presence with things they enjoy. So often we think of food. So treats that we use at Toronto Humane Society, we use the chicken and broth Heinz baby food, which is delicious apparently, they love it, as well as our churro tube treats, which we also find quite popular, and Temptations brand dry treats. We try not to use too many treats just to reduce a variety of treats so that we can kind of reduce the likelihood of diarrhea. But these 3 things are things that we frequently use with our more behaviorally compromised cats. We use Temptations with all cats, but these other 2 things with the behaviorally compromised cat. And then, so here, the way you give the treats is also very important. So this is a video of a treat trail that we encourage them to use. So choice is very important to the cats. So we like to make sure that we're not kind of making the cat feel cornered. We're encouraging the cat to come to us. So it seems silly to be showing someone how to do a treat trail, but I learned so much over time that I like to pass on to people where possible. I used to just put a treat in front of the cat, put another treat 2 inches away, put another 2 inches away, and then sit on the other side of the room and wait, and had very, very poor success. Then I learned if you throw a treat kind of just in front of the cat's face, and provided they eat it, as soon as they're done eating and they look up for the next treat, if you throw the treat another, let's say 2 inches away from their face, so right when they're looking up, they see the other treat fall, that movement of the treat falling can really encourage them to come forward on their own. So that way we often get them to come out on their own, which can be really powerful for bolstering their confidence and helping us work with them. And then of course, some cats are less motivated by treats and more motivated by play. So for play, for these more fearful cats, we really like to encourage people to use just a string on a stick. These more fearful cats tend to respond much better to that. So the wand toys often come with a big ball on the end, and for our more fearful cats, that can be a little bit much. So we like just a string on a stick and kind of just gently pulling it in front of their face. Sometimes pulling it out of view, that can often perk a cat's interest quite a lot. So the volunteers are trained on all these methods. And then for these cats that are involved in this program, they are also almost always on a formal behavior modification plan. So our primary behavior modification plan that they are on is a desensitization and counter conditioning to touch plan. And lesser degrees, some of them are on a clicker training program where we're often teaching them to station to go to specific spots, or sometimes just to do general tricks for a variety of other reasons. So I'm going to show you a video of the desensitization and counter conditioning to touch BMOD plan. This is by far the BMOD plan that we use the most. So here is the video. I'm not 100% sure if the sound got shared, but the sound on this video is not fantastic anyway. So if you can't hear it, you're not missing much. So this kitten doesn't look like she's under social, but I assure you, she was not having it being touched at all. I'm just keeping my distance from her and keeping her under threshold until she's ready to move to the next part of the plan. So you can see over time, my hand is getting closer and closer to her in association with food until she's licking it right off my hand. Once she seems relatively comfortable with that, I introduce my second hand in. You can see she's looking at that hand very warily, but it's not moving, importantly. So she says, okay. So I remove my hand and the stick at the same time, and then I reintroduce them with the hand a little bit closer this time. But the hand again is not moving. It only arrives with the food and disappears with the food. This time it's much closer, and you can see her sniffing it quite closely before going back to eating. And now I slowly start introducing just a gentle touch. And over time, we make that touch more and more firm, and eventually it does work. So this, of course, works much better with kittens than it does with adult cats, but it does work with adult cats, with many adult cats. If a cat's, of course, unsocialized, we do see some progress, but never to that extent. But often it works quite well, even with just our cats who are perfectly socialized. They're just very fearful and shut down in the shelter. That can be a good way to kind of gradually gain their trust. So that is one of our primary behavior modification plans that we can do. So then, of course, they record the data. So this table here shows the way that we record the data. We do it in an Excel database. And so they record, each row represents a different session. So we can see the date, the time, and the name. This helps us to pick out maybe patterns in the data. Perhaps the cat always does best in the PM or the AM, or does better with males or females, and we can just kind of see how we can use that to our advantage. Sometimes it pops up, sometimes it doesn't. And then we have, you can see the RTP score, the FAS score, the PIP score, and the FIS score. And these are all, of course, 0 to 5. And we can see, for example, for the RTP, it started at a 5, which is the worst. And then over time, gradually started to come down. And by the end, we have 3 zeros in a row. So this cat's really loving pets. So that's generally how their session goes. So they do their homework, they use a considerate approach, they start giving the cats things they enjoy, then they conduct their BMOD, and then they record the data. And we use this data to be able to visualize how the cat is doing quite easily by looking at graphs. Love looking at graphs. They're such an amazing tool at getting kind of just a bird's eye view of how the case is going. And I find it really helpful in making decisions about that case and then how to treat future cases that are presenting similarly. So next we'll move on to training the raters. So we had a volunteer training assistant program. So these were high-level volunteers that wanted to get involved more on actual training of the animals as opposed to kind of just hanging out with them. And we started with 16. We've done far more than 16 by now. This is the ones that are in the paper. And so the training program was 2-hour sessions, so 3 2-hour sessions that were done remotely via Zoom in the evenings. The first of these 2-hour sessions, I introduced the standardized interaction approach and introduced the behavior modification programs that they would be using. The second of the 2-hour sessions, I described the FAS and the RTP. So it took an hour on FAS and an hour on RTP. Within each training, we talked about Well, it says right there, training on each ordinal scale. We talked about the purpose of the scale. I always feel that people do a better job when they understand exactly why they're recording things. So for example, talking about how participation in play, not playing doesn't necessarily mean you have poor welfare, but play generally is thought of as an indicator of good welfare within animal behavior, because if you are an animal experiencing poor welfare, we rarely see play in the wild. So then they would watch 2 videos of each level. So 2 RTP examples of what an RTP0 is, and 2 examples of what an RTP3 is, and so on. Then I would introduce some FAQs, so questions that I get quite a lot, or parts where I get stumped up, and so getting ahead of that. And then we have just general questions and discussion. So we would do that in the second session. We would do that for FAS and RTP. And then in the third 2-hour session, we would do that for the PIP and the FIS. Then after, oh, actually, I'll just show you a couple examples of the videos for each score of each session. So for RTP, here is an example of what a cat who is an RTP of 0 would be. And as a reminder, a cat with an RTP of 0 approaches you and actively interacts with you. May have tail up, might be rubbing against you, might be headbutting, might be vocalizing cheerfully, might be purring. Here's an RTP of 0. Cat's clearly into it. Making some biscuits for me there, rubbing up against stuff all around the environment, walking around. All right, and here is a cat with an RTP of 2. Just as a reminder, a cat with an RTP of 2 stays where they are, but shows mild signs of enjoyment. So they often lift their chin slightly when you pet them, and often still have a tense body. So far, it's hard to really tell if the cat's enjoying it or if he's just tolerating it. But there's a couple of moments where it really does seem like he's pushing back into it. An RTP of 2 is a bit harder to see on a video, but you can sure feel it when you're there because you can feel them pushing back against you. You can see that there is some signs of fear, anxiety, and stress here. The cat's lip licking, his pupils are big, he's kind of in that little loaf posture. But he is showing some signs of enjoying petting. Mild signs of enjoying it. Really, you can feel it more than you can see it. Poor little thing. And here is an RTP of 4. That's where they stay where they are, but show signs of not wanting to be touched. So flinching from your hand, flattening their ears as your hand approaches, dilating their pupils, or having a tense body. So again, they stay where they are, but there's certainly signs that they don't want what's happening. So here I'm just throwing a few treats in first. This cat is clearly quite fearful. Huge pupils. Letting the cat sniff my finger first, using a bit of a considerate approach. And for safety, in this instance, I'm starting with petting the wand just for safety, just to make sure the cat wasn't going to react with the swat to my hand. And I thought I saw some relaxation at one point while I pet her with the wand, just the teeniest amount. So I proceeded with petting her with my hand. You can see just kind of flinching away from it or shying away from it, pressing her head against the back of the box. And you can see as I removed my hand, that ear go back up. So clearly she was showing some clear signs that she didn't want to be touched. And in reality, full disclosure, I would not recommend. I don't ever like to see RTPs this high. I always tell people, if you don't, only pet the cat if you think they're going to like it. So we don't like to see RTPs this high. It's unsafe and unwise for the cat. But just to give you an example of what it would look like. So, and then to test the raters, after each session, so after the session number 2, where they did the FAS and the RTP, and then after the session number 3, where they did the PIP and the FIS, they would be given, so after the first session, they were given 2 tests, one on the FAS and one on the RTP. And for each of those, they were sent 30 short videos using WeTransfer, and they had to score each video from 0 to 5 for the score that test was for. So for the RTP, they got 30 videos and they had to score them for the RTP. And for the FAS, they got 30 different videos and they had to score those for the FAS. They then send them back to me, and I compared them against a reference standard, and the reference standard was just my scores of what I thought those were. And we looked for agreement using a linear weighted Cohen's kappa and reliability using an interclass coefficient. So what did we find? Well, I'm just going to show you the results for the linear weighted kappa and the reliability with the interclass coefficient. But a little explanation first. So these two scales, you're not really, I mean, the literature says not to use interpretive scales, such as like what equals good interpretation, or what equals good agreement, what equals fair agreement, what equals almost perfect agreement, but almost every paper does. So just for ease of interpretation, while we're having this talk, I thought I would kind of present what generally is indicated as slight, fair, moderate, substantial, and almost perfect for the linear weighted kappa, and what is generally thought of as poor, moderate, good, or excellent for the ICC. So for the kappa, this here is the interpretation proposed by Landis and Koch. This is the most commonly used one. And you can see that if the score is between 0 and 0.2, that's thought of as slight. And all the way up to from 0.8 to 1 is thought of as almost perfect. So the bars that are about to appear on the screen represent the kappa for the FAS, RTP, PIP, and FIS of my 16 volunteers after receiving my training. Just the online training, they still hadn't done any hands-on training at all. And you can see that they got almost perfect agreement in every single one of these scales, which is awesome. Often you'll see papers published using similar types of scoring systems, which have much lower kappas, and they are considered good. So this is fantastic. I was thrilled with these results. So similarly, we'll look at the ICC. And again, we have poor is 0 to, I don't know, let's say 0.5. And excellent is from 9 to 1. And again, these are the FAS, RTP, PIP, FIS for the ICC for my 16 volunteers. And you can see that they got excellent, which is the highest category, in every single one of them. So I was through the moon. Obviously, the training system, obviously the scales were good enough to be understood by people, and the training was good enough to help them feel confident and to accurately portray what it was I wanted them to portray. Yeah. So now that hopefully I've convinced you that these scales can have excellent reliability between raters, I want to show you a little bit about how we actually use them to manage cases. Excuse me. So cat 1 here represents a cat who has a typical response to the shelter environment. So you'll see on day 1, they had a pretty high stress response to the shelter environment with the because, you know, despite our best efforts, shelter's a scary place. Most cats see only their home for the majority of their lives. They show up to the only new place they've ever been, and it is scary. Separation from everything that they're familiar with, coupled with exposure to all sorts of new sights, smells, sounds, people, other cats, just everything is chaos to them. And then they show a gradual improvement over an approximately 5-day habituation period. You see this in a number of different papers looking at how long it takes for cats to habituate to a shelter. It's about this. Not every one of the scales tracked exactly the same, but they show a very similar picture. The fact that all 4 scales reduce in a similar timeline in this case study supports their construct validity. So then we have cat number 2. So this represents a cat who experienced a reduction in stress in response to an intervention. So in this case, the cat did show that initial stress response, so their scores were very high at the beginning, but they didn't really show that reduction that we saw in cat 1 in a comparable time frame. So instead, the reduction was only really observed after the administration of gabapentin, and that's days 5 to 7, which are represented here in this green block over top of it. So as these data only really show one case, we can't definitively say that the reduction in the 4 scales was resulted from the gabapentin, although it's pretty clear to me. But it does show us how we can use these 4 scales in a research environment to evaluate the success of different measures, of different interventions that we want to try to impose to help cats in similar cases in the future. And this can help with both scientific investigation of what drugs are the best to use in certain circumstances, as well as helping us to manage similar cases going forward. So we could say that in general, we seem to see a quicker decline when we use gabapentin than, I don't know, clonazepam. Or putting cats in an out-of-cage space really does show a big improvement. Or giving cat a social companion, giving an under-social cat a social companion reduces a huge drop in these things. And it helps us guide future decisions. So finally, we have cat 3. So this represents a cat who also experienced that initial stress response to the shelter housing environment. But it doesn't show any of the improvement really, other than FIS, that cat 1 or 2 experienced. So it does show that reduction in FIS, like I mentioned, but reduction in food intake, increase in food intake alone is not enough to interpret the psychological well-being of the cat as acceptable, right? This cat is unhappy, it's suffering. So interventions such as environmental management, so giving it out-of-cage space or a social companion, or putting it on a formalized behavior modification plan, utilizing the desensitization and counter-conditioning plan that we showed earlier, or psychopharmaceuticals that were employed, none of these things made an impact on this cat's behavior. I didn't choose to represent those on the graph here like I did with the big green bar over here, but believe me, we tried all of those things. So these data, in combination with information from the cat's intake form and the cat's medical evaluation, were useful in determining that the cat was not really appropriate for placement in a traditional home environment. And this cat was ultimately placed through a barn cat program. So this helps us to both make the decision and also justify the decision. So I'm sure many on this call, to them, barn placement is not a controversial topic, but it still is in many circles, something that you do need to take into account, that some people don't agree with the program. So being able to use this data to justify, we're really doing this in the cat's best interest. This cat's suffering, like we can show things. It's not just our opinion. We can actually point to numbers. So in conclusion, my 4 behavioral rating systems were created and may be helpful in evaluating well-being in shelter cats. And that with some initial training, they've been shown to have excellent interobserver reliability. And that monitoring scores on these scales may be helpful in evaluating the success of environmental enrichment and behavior modification efforts and medication in responses to specific interventions. So that is the paper. But I wanted to show a couple of other bonus things, ways we use data in similar systems to also help the cats at Toronto Humane's. So I mentioned earlier doing presence-absence behavior. So this is how we use presence-absence behavior. So we use a summary score of presence-absence behaviors, of key behaviors that are exhibited during these behavior modification sessions. So we picked out a few desirable behaviors and a few undesirable behaviors. The desirable behaviors are eating. So obviously the food intake score is measuring eating, but that's eating over a 24-hour period. I always find it so useful to know if that cat is eating in human presence. So if they are eating in front of you during that session, they get a +1. If they are playing in front of you, they get a +1. And if the cat is out in the open in front of you, they get a +1. So basically not hiding. The undesirable behaviors that we measure are swat or bite, and that's whether they're successful or unsuccessful. And if they hiss or growl. So these are undesirable behaviors, they get a -1. The data is recorded similarly. You'll see each row here is a different session. And these are the undesirable behaviors, swat, bite, hiss, growl, and the desirable behaviors, ate, treat, played, out in the open. And then there's a summary score that just adds together all of these. So in this particular row with Mike, this cat didn't do any of these behaviors, so it got a 0. A little later on with Dave, it did hiss or growl, but it didn't do any of the other behaviors, so it gets a -1. Way down at the bottom with Wendy, we see none of the undesirable behaviors and 2 out of the 3 desirable behaviors. So this cat gets a 2. And you can see over time, we are able to make a graph to track the progress in these behaviors as well. And I think that it really complements those, the ordinal rating scales. And finally, one other thing we do track, which is their progress in these behavior modification plans. So when conducting behavior modification plans, especially when it's not the same person conducting the plan every day, it's really crucial to know how far the person the day before you got, so you can kind of know what to expect and whether or not you're actually making progress. So to do this, we define the steps. So for example, in that video of the desensitization and counter conditioning to touch, perhaps step 1 is the cat actually ate food in front of you. So it actually eat food off the stick. Perhaps step 2 is your hand is choked up about and only a foot away from the stick where the cat's eating off of. Perhaps step 4 is the cat's actually eating off your finger. And perhaps step 5 is your hand is right next to the cat's face when it's eating. And perhaps step 10 is you're able to pet the cat without them even needing food. So here we can see an example of the full data, basically, of these sessions. So again, each row is a session. Let's just pick one. So we can say this first one here, Doreen at 9 a.m. These are the summary scores. So we can see the individual presence absence behaviors. This cat got a summary score of 1. The RTP was she did not attempt it because she looked at that cat and thought, this cat does not want me to pet him, so I'm not going to. And then we have an FAS of 3, a PIP of 5, and an FIS of 0. Unfortunately, the cat did not eat anything off the end of the wand, so it got a 0 for its DSCC score. But if we go halfway through, we'll look at Gail here. So Gail had a summary score of 2, so we see some improvement here based from Doreen's visit. Then we have still not attempting to pet, an FAS of 2, which is lower, and a PIP of 3, which is also lower, and FIS is still the same, and now we're at a DSCC score of 6, which is great. This is an improvement. And all the way down to the bottom with Verna, we have the cat getting a 3 in summary scores, a 0 in RTP, an FAS of 1, PIP of 0, and a DSCC of 10. So again, we can check that DSCC score progress with a graph as well, which always makes it so much quicker to just look at every progress of every one of these cats that you're concerned enough to put on a plan. But if you're having a really busy day, you might only be able to really in depth look into, I don't know, let's say you have 10 cats on this plan, and you have in one day, you just want to kind of check over how everyone's doing and really address problems, the cases that are experiencing more problems, so you can see how you can be adjusting the plan to help them out more. You can look at a glance at these graphs and say, okay, this cat is improving here, here, and here. This cat is improving here, here, and here. This cat, I'm not seeing any improvement. And it's been on this plan long enough that I would expect to see improvement. Perhaps I should be talking to a veterinarian about the potential for getting them on a behavior medication. Perhaps I should be considering getting them a social companion. Perhaps I should be considering moving them to a more quiet space in the shelter. And you can, instead of having to review all of those 10 cats, just case notes upon case notes, case notes, you can snapshot, look at their scores, and it really helps you to prioritize your time and efforts. So that, in a nutshell, is both the paper that I wanted to present today and a couple of other interesting tidbits about how we use data to help our cats beyond just doing better, beyond people saying, oh, he's doing better, how we can actually really get to the heart of what's going on and really be more effective with our time and energy. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you. I didn't mention it earlier, but I wanted to, I posted it in the chat, just wanted to open the floor to any questions. So feel free to pop them in the Q&A section. Also, I'm watching the chat as well. So if you have questions for Dr. Ellis, feel free to do so. One of the questions that I had was in shelters that maybe don't have a lot of enriched housing spaces, can this system be used cage side effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say primarily we use this in out of cage space. There are cases where we do this with cats in cages though. Generally, we use our out of cage space for cats that are the most behaviorally compromised. So, and we are very fortunate to have quite a large amount of out of cage space. But there does come a time when all of our out of cage space is full and we have other cats on top of that do need to have these plans worked with them. There's limitations in terms of obviously space, and many of these cats are so fearful that you get more success the more space you can put between yourself and the cat, at least at first. And you don't really want to be reaching into hidey holes to pet cats, but if you can get them to come to the front, you can absolutely still do all of these things in their cages.
Okay, amazing. We'll just have a boo to see if there's any questions at all. I think the last question that I had would be, do you have, I didn't get a sense of how much time investment is sort of per session or per, like it seems quite exhaustive, but my guess is that as you get good at it, it's a relatively quick process. Do you
Yeah,
have
it
a
doesn't
sense
take
of time
really any
investment?
It really doesn't take any more time than the time that the volunteers are already spending with the cats. They're just using their time in a way that's more specific, let's say. So all of the volunteers that are in this program were already volunteers for us that were coming and interacting with the cats for, generally we say about 20 minutes per session is the length of time that a volunteer spends with a cat. And this session can be done in 20 minutes. So definitely, it can be done in less if the cat really wants you to leave. But we do generally say to spend 20 minutes a cat to make sure that we try to get this done ideally with the cats twice a day. I would say most days cats are getting this once a day. But there are certainly some days where we have a huge number of volunteers or a small number of cats and they get it 3 times a day, which is great. And there are some cats we find better success with if you stay for longer. And so sometimes that'll be in that instruction section to stay a little longer. But generally, it takes no more time than the regular sessions that the volunteers were already staying for. And I can't speak to the number of volunteers that other shelters have or the frequency with which they come or the number of volunteers they have a day. But in general, people are pretty excited to have the task of like go hang out with the animals. So, and I find the volunteers at Toronto Humane Society are thirsty for knowledge and instruction, and they really want their time to be as effective as possible. The number of trainings that we assign to our volunteers, I always think, oh, poor volunteers, they're just so inundated with this. And I'm always shocked. They come up to me and they're always asking for more. I can't believe it. So they really want their time to be as well spent as possible. And the volunteers in this program, they experience a lot of ups and downs, I suppose. They witness a lot of heartbreaking situations where cats that are just the most scared cats at the shelter, but then they get to see them improve most of the time. And so seeing that transformation from just a terrified cat that's, panting, breathing, and to become a lap cat by the end of it sometimes is very rewarding for them. They really love it.
Right, amazing. Looks like there's just one question. Are volunteers recording what they see on paper or a software?
So we use Excel. They enter it straight onto the Excel. There's computer stations around the shelter. When I first started at the shelter, the volunteers were entering all of their information, pen and paper. And then I would spend a ridiculous amount of time transcribing all of that into the computer, which was not very time effective. We did experience a bit of a pushback when we first started asking them to enter all of the data electronically. But in my experience, anytime you change anything, you're going to experience a certain amount of pushback. There was a cost, of course, associated with getting computers around the shelter where we could enter this type of information. A lot of the time, there are places that are willing to donate relatively older computers, and you don't need a lot of processing power for Excel. And so that was a godsend for us. Because it saved so much time on my behalf of having to enter what these volunteers were writing in each of their interaction sessions into a database. And also, sometimes you're writing all this information and you think, this is just blocks of text. This isn't really helping me. Am I actually going to come back and read this later or not? So now having the numbers is just so much more useful. And I do have a section in it, I should say, where they can write in free text if they want for any useful comments. And I do find that I don't read all of those. But when there's a time I want to read them, I'm so happy they're there. So for example, we'll have a cat that has, their scores are steadily improving. And then there's 3 days where their scores are awful. And then they go back to being pretty good. You think, what happened there? And you can look and say in the comments, it'll say something like, there was construction right outside their cage. You're like, oh, okay, well then that's fine. I will interpret that accordingly. And we do also have a section where we track when they're in out of cage space, when they're not in out of cage space, when they have a social companion, when they don't have a social companion, when they're on a behavior medication, when they're not on a behavior medication, so that we can look for, wow, they made a huge improvement. What happened there? Oh, they got moved out of cage space. So we know how much of an impact that had on their numbers.
Another question that came through was, there's a comment that says we use a lot of paper tracking in our centers. Would you be willing to share a template of your Excel doc? Yeah,
sure, absolutely. If you want to send me an email asking for that, I can absolutely send that to you. My email address is jellis@torontohumane.ca. Toronto Humane Society. In fact, I can probably just type it in the chat here.
Okay, perfect. Any more questions? The one question that I had, which I think you addressed, was the minute that you start a creature on gabapentin, there's no modification to the scale. They don't get an adjustment, knowing that they're on a med.
No, because we want to see the change. So we have to make sure we're always like a 3 is always a 3 is always a 3, even if there's construction going on, even if they're on drugs, even if their best friend just left for surgery, you know, no matter what's happening in their environment, we want the scale to have true meaning. It's always the same number. And then we just interpret it with all that other stuff in mind.
Okay, sounds good. And then another question that came in the chat, are these cats on hold, or would you consider sending them to foster?
It really depends on exactly why they're with us. Like sometimes they're cats that are being considered for barn placement. Often these are cats that come in as stray, and we don't know anything about their history, or we do know something about their history and it suggests that they are not appropriate for a home environment. There are lots of different things we do to determine whether they're appropriate for barn placement. And while we're searching for barn placement, we continue to have them on behavior modification in attempts to improve and be able to pursue a barn pathway, an adoption pathway. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So that's some of the cats. So those cats would not be available and would not be available for foster. Sometimes cats are available for adoption and available for foster while we're working with them on this plan. So if the cat has a wonderful intake profile that suggests they do so well in a home, but they are not coping well with the shelter, we know that the best thing for this cat is to just get out of the shelter, to go to a home. So they're available for foster and available for adoption. Whatever gets them out fastest, great. However, until we're able to find that placement, we're going to do everything within our power to help improve their perception of the environment that they're in. And that's usually through this program, often with the desensitization and counter conditioning to touch, even though technically they're socialized to touch, they just aren't, they don't remember because the fear is blocking it. So we're trying to do everything we can to help them out there. So that's the answer is both. Often they're available and available for foster, and just we do this while we're waiting. As you can imagine, it's a lot easier to place a cat in a foster home or an adoptive home that is showing well, and people can go in and kind of watch somebody pet it or pet it themselves. And these cats are not necessarily those, even if we know they'll be like that in a home. If they're not like that there, it can take a while to find a placement sometimes.
Sounds good. Another question that came in was, how do you recommend introducing companion cats for under-socialized cats?
Yeah, so this is a question I get a lot because I use companion cats for under-socialized cats a lot. We have intense protocols for how to introduce socialized cats, especially cats that have lived in a home environment for long periods of times and potentially have never seen another cat, at least since they were kittens. For under-socialized cats, especially if they come from a colony or come from a hoarding situation, I don't really do a lot, especially if they are terrified of humans. I find often, sometimes I just put the other cat in the room and they instantly come out of hiding and rub up against it and everything's wonderful. I have this video, I wish I could play it now. That's an example of exactly that. This cat that was in our care for, gosh, 2 weeks and just was terrified of everything. And we brought another cat out and it instantly came out of hiding. I was rubbing all against it and against the walls. And sometimes I don't do much. Every once in a while, I do have an office that has an out of cage space right next to it, and there's a door between them. Sometimes I'll put a cat door, like a baby gate, between the two, and when I leave for the night, allow them to greet. Sometimes I'll put 2 baby gates so they can't jump over it, allow them to go nose to nose in front of it. But often, more often than not, with under social cats, I kind of just put them together. I've never had a problem with it. They're usually quite poorly socialized to humans, but really well socialized to other cats.
Okay. Well, that looks like all that has come through. So this will be a good time to wrap up. So very grateful, Dr. Ellis, for your time and your expertise on this topic. Just wanted to say as well, for the CASMA webinars, we are all finished for 2023. But stay tuned for the second part of our All Things Bunny webinar planned for February 2024. So thank you everyone for participating, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
You know,
Bye.
bye.